One of the most common things growing up in my family was pasta, and watching my grandmother just kick out tons and tons of pasta always amazed me, and I thought it was one of those things that only she could do and only she did right. And I got to tell you, I still remember hers as the best, followed only second by my mom, so hopefully my mom won't feel too bad about that. But pasta really comes together pretty quickly. What you want to start with is some durum semolina. And durum semolina is a flour. It's actually a very hard wheat flour, and you're looking for a hard wheat flour because this is going to be a nice tight pasta, but you're going to be surprised how light it actually is when we're all finished. You can also make this with a whole wheat flour, all-purpose flour. Pretty much any flour will make a pasta, but how you put it together might be a little bit different. But for durum semolina, I like to use about a cup of flour to a pinch of salt. I want to work that with my hands, and you're going to be pretty amazed at how quickly this comes together. Now I'm going to add water. Some people like to put eggs in their pasta. Personally speaking, there's just such a big demand now for eggless pasta that I have just reworked my recipe to be eggless. And if you put an egg in here, it's going to be a little richer, a little finer, but I think at the end of the day, it's going to be hard-pressed to really see the difference, especially with the applications we're going to use. I've got cold tap water here, and I've made a well in my semolina flour so that I could add my tap water into it, and I'm going to work that around. And what I'm looking for here is I'm trying for the consistency of, I'd say, wet sand at low tide. Now, I can say that because we're at the beach and it seems to make sense for me, but really what I'm trying to do is be able to clump it in my hand pretty tightly. And I'm going to add only a small amount at a time because unlike making, say, a pie crust where you don't want to overdevelop the gluten or the protein structure, in pasta, just the opposite. You're going to really work this guy. Now, a little bit more water and I'm good. Now, if by accident you add too much water, you don't want to add more semolina flour because you don't have the right table for hydrating that pasta flour. What you want to add is a little bit of all-purpose flour to compensate. I think we're not going to have to worry about that, quite frankly, because I think this is coming together nicely. And I will just bring this all together. And I think at this point I could actually, let's move these out of the way, and I'll move this to my board to finish kneading that just a little bit more by hand. Now, my grandmother used to take this pasta at this point. I think my mother did the same thing, and she would work it on the board. And she'd work it until it came together pretty well. And as you can see, it comes together pretty well. But they would work this for anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes. I found a way around that. Now you can see some of these scraps falling off. I'm not going to worry so much about those. I'm going to gather them up and just press my dough ball into it. And you can see they quickly absorb it. Now what I'm going to want to do is I just want to make sure that I have a nice tight ball and that it feels to me almost like silly putty. It's kind of soft yet firm, if that makes sense. I make myself into a nice little disc, and this I'm going to wrap with a little bit of plastic film. And that will then sit for about an hour and a half to 2 hours for a couple of reasons. Let me wrap that and show you what we're doing. So our wrapped dough ball is going to go into the refrigerator for about, like I said, an hour and a half tops. And what we're looking to do is not so much cool it or even relax the gluten structure. What we're looking to do here is let that pasta flour hydrate. That water we added needs to kind of get dispersed amongst all the semolina, and it'll hydrate really well. So we're going to come back here in about an hour and a half, and we're going to show you what we can do with that finished dough. So after an hour and a half, the dough is rested, and you can see, I'll take it out of the plastic film, it's actually changed color a little bit. It got from that lighter color we started with to more of a rich color. It's fully hydrated at this point, so it's nice and supple. I'm going to cut this into 4 sections, and it just makes it easier for me to work through my machine. And what I'm going to do is move the rest of the dough over there for a moment. And if it's a little damp, that's okay. We're just going to dip it in flour. And I've got my pasta machine ready to go. Now, you could roll this by hand. If you roll this by hand, it's going to be a long process. And the more you develop the pasta, the harder it's going to be to roll. And that's what my grandmother used to do, and I hope she'll forgive me for using a machine because I think it's just the way to go in today's world. I've got my machine set at number 1. And what I'm going to do is rest my pasta on top, and I'm going to start forcing this through. And by cranking it down, you can see the pasta's falling out the other end. Now, because I didn't develop it too much by hand, it comes out and it looks a little crumbly, but that's okay, because this is my opportunity to develop the gluten in my dough. So a little broken pasta is actually a desirable thing at this point. It tells me, it gives me a visible sign of how much I need to work it. And as you can see, the first time I put it through, I fold it in half and in half again, work it through the machine, and you can start to see that it's changing texture, and it's certainly holding its shape now for us. And I do this generally 3 times through, just to get the shape firm, and then 3 times more to work the dough. So, and whenever I feel like I've got enough time through my pasta machine, I always like to go 1 or 2 more times. Let's just move my board back. There we go. And again, each time I do it, I'm going to a third fold. So just to recap that, fold it towards the center, and then the other side towards the center. Now, from time to time, your dough, as you're beginning to develop that gluten, might feel a little tacky to the hand. So I like to just dip it in the flour after I have folded it, and that's pretty key. I don't want to incorporate too much flour, and then feed that in. Let's move that forward just a tiny bit. There we go. And what I'm left with is a really nice, and you can see how it stretches and comes back. That's a nice elastic pasta dough. I'm going to go ahead and work the other 4. When I'm finished, we're going to go ahead and make a fettuccine, a ravioli, and a tortellini. We also want to do one more pasta that we like to call rags here, and I'll explain that here in a minute. So after you have mixed the pasta and developed that gluten, what you have is nice long strips. Now, don't be concerned that they're not all even at this point. We're going to remedy that as we continue to work the dough. But as these sit, you want to put a little bit of flour in them. Just fold them over, because they continue to hydrate. And as they do that, they get a little sticky, and this just keeps them from sticking to your board. And I'll put a little bit more flour on this last one, because I'm going to go back to my machine with it now. Now keep in mind, when we started this process, we added some semolina flour, some sea salt, and just a little bit of sea salt, just to kind of give you a little flavor, and water. Wet sand, low tide consistency. We then kneaded it on number 1. And since this has been sitting for a while we work the others, I like to go through number 1 one more time in case it's puffed a bit. And then I'm going to take it to number 2, and I'm going to work it through. And every time I do it, what's happening is these die mechanisms, these rollers are coming together and making it tighter and tighter and tighter, making it thinner and thinner and thinner. Once I hit it on number 2, I'll skip it to number 4, and I'll do 2 sequences. So I'll go from 4 to 6, and then I need to make a decision on what consistency I want. But everything I do generally at least takes to number 6. So as you can see, it's much longer now. I'm going to let that just fall naturally. We're going to work this through. And I love working this by hand. Now, there are motor attachments to these machines, and I think they're fantastic. If you do a lot of pasta and you don't have a motor attachment, you definitely want to have a partner doing this with you. And as you can see, it's getting longer and thinner. Now, the first one we do, we're going to take the fettuccine. Now, we're going to work all these pretty much the same way. Let's finish this one, and we'll talk about the others here in a moment. But on fettuccine, also pappardelle, and those types of noodles, I take it about to a number 7, which is a nice thickness. I want to bring it back to the board. And what I want to do at this point, again, you can see that I've got a wider end and a shallower end. Not a concern. Not a concern at all. And you'll see why in a moment. I'm going to flour half of the pasta and then fold the other half over top. I'm going to flour the remaining pasta on my board, fold it over, flour again, fold it over. I am then turning the pasta so that I can see the seam where I have the bends in the pasta, and I'm going to roll it one more time towards me. So what I have is a nice little bundle that's ready to be cut. The first pasta we're going to do is fettuccine, and what I'm going to do to square it off is I'm going to take the ends off on both sides, and I kind of alluded at the beginning of this segment that we're going to have a product called rags. Rags to us is that torn or ripped pieces, or in my case, those ends that, yeah, if you're trying to do a nice finished plate, you want them all to look fairly even, but the rags are something that you can use for staff meal, or quite frankly, they're great. They all taste the same. We're just talking about visual at this point. I'm now going to cut my remaining pasta, which is about, I'd say, I don't know, 4 inches. I'm going to cut it in half. So now I have 2-inch pieces. Cut each of those in half. Now if I open it up, I have my finished pasta. And I like to open them up all the way to make sure they don't stick, because now that we're dealing with fresh pasta, it can stick as it sits. I'm going to grab a sheet pan, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this pasta. Keep in mind we've kind of unwound it, so to speak. I'm going to add a little bit more all-purpose flour, just toss it gently, and I'm going to continue on. If I wanted this to all be fettuccine, I would continue on having my pile of my pasta rags on one side and my fettuccine on the other side. Now, when it's thick cut like this, it's also called pappardelle. Pappardelle, if you've seen dried, sometimes has ridges in it as well, but both are pretty much the same thickness. Going back to the rags for a moment, you can also tear it to create those rags. So there's no end limitation as far as what you can do with pasta at this point. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use these for other things as well. So when I finish up, I'm going to have all these rolled out to the desired width, and then we're going to come back and make raviolis and tortellinis. So we've rolled all the other pastas out, and I want to show you one more roll of the pappardelle. So keep in mind we have the pasta, we took it to number 6. I'm folding it in half after I've floured half of it. I'm going to flour yet another half, fold again and again. I turn that seam towards me, and in this time I'm going to go ahead and once again trim those rags off, and I'm going to put those over on my sheet pan. And I'm going to cut these even a little bit thinner because some people, I think more traditional fettuccine is going to be a lot thinner. So I can do that as well. So in the last one I was able to get 4 sections, now I got 8 sections. And you'll see the difference here in comparison. Pop them open, kind of break them apart if you will. And now you've got kind of a thicker fettuccine and a thinner fettuccine. But once again, a little bit of flour. Now, you don't want to store this at room temperature because you now have a potentially hazardous food. Semolina alone is fine, but once you add water to it, you now have an opportunity for bacteria to grow. So what I like to do is, by adding a lot of flour, it doesn't stick together. I cover it with another piece of parchment paper, or you can use a little bit of saran wrap, plastic film, loosely covered in your refrigerator. It's good for 2 or 3 days. It'll be good longer, but like anything in the refrigerator, it'll start to pick up flavors. All right, so to do our ravioli, what we're going to do, we're going to start by cleaning off our board. And we'll put our pasta down, but one of the things we want to think about is, okay, what are we going to fill the ravioli with? So let me go ahead and take a moment. I'm going to get my ravioli fillings together. We'll mix them up in front, and then we'll start making our ravioli together. Now, when filling a ravioli, you really have a lot of choices. For me, I always like to start with a good ricotta cheese, and I like to use a whole milk ricotta cheese. But the problem with all ricotta cheese is that there's a lot of whey along with the curd, and that's just going to be a problem for you down the road when you actually fill the ravioli. So what I like to always do when I'm making ravioli is I like to get a little cheesecloth, and this is a lot of cheesecloth, but this is about 5 pounds of ricotta cheese. I'm going to move it to our bowl here. I'll get rid of this, and as you can see, I've already changed it overnight, but you have some of that whey separating out from the curds, and it collects in the bottom. A lot more collected when I first checked it this morning. Okay, so we have our really incredible ricotta cheese. And I'm going to take a little bit out. Now it's very dry at this point. I can literally scoop it out. And I pop it into the bowl here, and I'm only going to take what I need because I can hang the rest and use it for a later ravioli or tortellini or other filling. And so into this mixture, I'm going to grab a couple of key ingredients. The first one I'm going to do is a little bit of sea salt, and then some pepper, coriander, and other items. Before I add any salt, however, you always want to taste your food as you're cooking, and that to me is probably more key than anything you do in the kitchen. What you should be looking for, that's nice. It should taste like the farm. It should be just incredibly milky, rich on the tongue. And I am looking for how much salt is needed, so I'm trying to determine how much salt was used. I'm going to use a couple pinches of wet sea salt. Mix that around. I'm going to use 2 turns of freshly cracked black pepper. And as I've said previously, it's important that the seeds, anytime you use a seed or spice, that you toast it first to release some of those essential oils so that the flavor is really pronounced. And I'm going to use several turns of my coriander mill. Again, coriander being the berry of the cilantro plant. And I'm going to mix that around, and I'll tell you, it is just so aromatic from where I'm standing. And I'm getting some nice color too. So using a cracked seed like a peppercorn and coriander just gives you yet some additional textural feel in the mouth. pinch of fresh chopped parsley. Oh, I'd say a pinch or two of some fresh mozzarella cheese. Now you can use Parmesan cheese, but again, you want to know what you're doing before you start, because if I use Parmesan cheese, which can be a little salty in and of itself, I'd use less sea salt in this recipe. Now, before I add my raw egg, I'm going to go ahead and taste it to see where we are. It's looking pretty good, and keep in mind, when you open this up, when the finished ravioli is in front of you, it should be visually appealing inside as well. That's great. So I think we have enough salt. And what I'm going to do here, it doesn't look like I need both eggs, so I'm going to put one to the side. And I'm not going to use the whole egg because the egg white is really going to bring a little too much moisture to the table. So I'm going to separate the egg yolk from the white. And I'm going to use just the yolk, which is going to be nice, and it's going to make this dish even that much more rich. All right, and since I drained it overnight, I'm not going to be too worried about that egg yolk adding too much water to my dish. So let's just move that white out of the way, and this is what a nice finished ravioli mix should look like. Now, when you're doing this at home, you're probably going to be making a little bit more than me. Just depends. If you're making for 1 or 2 people, this is really plenty because you're not going to use a lot of filling in the finished product. But what I always recommend to people is once you make the ravioli filling, either refrigerate it right away or store it on top of ice while you're working with it so that you don't have to worry about this warming up. 2 reasons. Food safety, warm ricotta filling is not a good thing, but more importantly, or I should say equally as important, once you fill the ravioli, you want it to stay firm. If it starts weeping on the dough, that's going to be a problem. All right, let's make some ravioli. I'm going to grab a small spoon, pop that in the filling, and let's grab our knife. Now, again, I have my pasta rolled out. Now, unlike the fettuccine / pappardelle in rags, I rolled that on a number 6. I took the ravioli to a number 7 because I want it a little bit thinner. And the reason is, keep in mind, with ravioli, you've got a top and a bottom. So those two together are going to make it actually a lot thicker. So I'm going to cut this in half, and I'll just check my measurement. It looks like I did a pretty good half. Now the bottom half, I'm going to take a pastry brush and just dust off any excess flour, because when I use my water to glue this together, I want to make sure it actually stays glued together fairly well. Now, if you want to be exact, you can take a ruler and you can score this off. For me, since I already have some pasta rags, I feel good about trimming this to kind of square it off. I'm not going to go too much on it because I can do it again once I put my lid on. You know, great culinary gift stores have ravioli cutters and things of that nature, so you can do a perfect square. Personally, I like the rustic look of something that was homemade, and so I don't generally use ravioli cutters. I'm going to go ahead and dust off the top piece of my ravioli dough. Now I can do this 1 of 2 ways. I can put dollops of my filling in the center, water wash it and put my top on, or I can do what I'm going to do and score them and make my raviolis individually. It's just a matter of preference. It doesn't matter either way. And one more. Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit of filling, and it helps if you have 2 spoons actually, because 1 spoon will put the filling in the center, and the other spoon kind of helps you along with that process. Very nice. Again, being in the center is pretty key. I'm going to grab a fork as well. I'll show you a little bit of a design I like to do. Before I do that, let's go ahead and move our filling to the side for a second. I'm going to get a little bit of water on my brush now, and I'm going to come around side, and I'm brushing over that flour. And I'm coming not all the way into the ravioli, but just far enough in so that when I put my top layer on, which I'm about to do, I can press it down around. Now as I'm doing this, what I'm trying to do is feel for the filling, come around all the way. If I make a crease, that's okay. And this is what we commonly call burping the ravioli. I love that phrase. And in Italian households, that's very appropriate. Okay, so I'm burping my ravioli. Now, as you can see, I have a nice top on my bottom. I'm going to grab a fork and I'm going to dip it in flour so it doesn't stick, and I'm just going to score or press down and work the ravioli around. And what this does is it ensures that I have a tight seal with the water. Now, Ravioli to me is just another name for something to put your sauce on. So I like to keep it like this, very rustic style. In restaurants, I will take a round cutter, and I can show you that here in one moment. Or I can take my knife and score it to kind of cut that around and make it much more even. Although, like I said, it all eats the same. It's pretty good. And that's what one looks like. I treat that the same way I treat my fresh pasta, like with the pappardelle. Number one, I'm going to keep these rags a little bit more to the side. I want to mix them with the other ones because they are double layer now. The ravioli, a little bit of flour, and I'm good for several days in the refrigerator. Let's just show that one more time. I'm going to take my ravioli filling. It's in the center. And I'm brushing the water along. Now again, when I say several days, I should probably correct myself. I'm thinking, 2 or 3 days because egg is now in the cheese, so you don't want to go too long. But in our house, it never lasts that long anyway, so that's really never a concern. Okay, so finish my little burping action here. And grab the fork. Make sure there's no excess flour there. And just, oops, let's stay away from those other raviolis. See, they're like magnets. They just attract each other. It's like that on my plate too. However, they never last that long. All right. A little bit more, and we are good. Now, I can use a cutter, and if I use a cutter, I'm just going to come in right over that ravioli. As you can see, cutter's just about a little bit bigger than the ravioli. Press down. These are just biscuit cutters you can buy at even your grocery store. And now I've got a great, perfect, round ravioli. But for my money, again, I like it rustic. I don't even trim it this much when I'm serving it, just for my wife and I. I think that's the way to go. Okay, so I'm going to come back in a few minutes and I'm going to show you how to do tortellini. Let's finish up these ravioli and we will be good to go. We finished our ravioli. As you can see, we've got 4. 2 of them were cut. The other ones were just kind of left more rustic. We're going to finish this off with some tortellini. Now again, like with the ravioli, I rolled the pasta on the number 7 setting, so it's a little thinner than the regular pappardelle or the fettuccine. I want to just scrape off some of that excess flour, and keep in mind that excess flour was there to keep it from sticking together. So you can see I get a lot of excess flour, but don't worry, that won't get wasted. That'll be used for our bread tomorrow, I'm sure. All right, so let's just using the back of my knife, I'm going to scrape that off the table. And we are good. Now, the difference between tortellini and ravioli is very minimal, quite frankly. A ravioli has a top and a bottom shell, whereas a tortellini, it's more of a fold over. It's probably the closest thing to an Asian dumpling that we have, and I'll show you how easy it really is. We're going to start by using the same filling we use for a ravioli. And for this, what I want to do is cut myself a nice square, and I'll cut 2, so we can do 2 right away. And once again, we're going to put some of that filling in the center. Now this time I'm going to go a little bit off center and closer to one of the corners.